Okay, good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Heidi Zuckerman. I'm the Nancy and Bob Magoon CEO and Director here at the museum. And I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight Oscar Murillo. Oscar was born in Colombia, and he lives and works primarily in London. His paintings, video works, actions are tied to the notion of community, stemming from his cross-cultural ties to diverse cities. His work has been shown globally at countless international arts institutions, and he is interested in the notion of cultural exchange and the multiple ways in which ideas, languages, and even everyday objects are displaced, circulated, and mixed together. He addresses themes of globalization and its attendant state of flux while maintaining the universality of the human experience. He is currently in a two-person exhibition with Tony Coates on view at the Shed in New York. He earlier had works in Shanghai and Kettle's Yard. He also is one of 4 shortlisted artists for the 2019 Turner Prize. I'm voting for you. And that will be announced in December. And he was nominated for that Turner Prize for the way that he pushes the boundaries of materials, particularly in his paintings. He was also nominated for the way that he reflects on his own experience of displacement and the social fallout of globalization. So I'd like to thank Alan and Kelly Questrom for making the Artist Lecture Series possible. Oscar is going to run through the slides, and then afterwards I'll come back up and we'll do a couple of questions and take a few from the audience. And we have sign language interpretation tonight as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. It's great to be here again. I was here last summer, and it's a very beautiful place. Aida and Alberto, who are here, who are both Colombian, they also understand nature. So I think it's a nice context to talk about art and culture. And so I knew I was going to come here for maybe 6 months or so, and I was really thinking as to how to conduct this conversation, how to conduct it in a way that looks at the intentions of my work early on, and obviously in hindsight, the ideas and reasons as to why I think I was doing certain things. I think more honestly, I think a lot of the things that I was doing were made or were done out of a kind of restless desire to find my way into painting or to art. I grew up in Europe. I grew up in London. I was educated in London. I went to art school. My formal art school training was in London. And I think it's very important to mention that in the context of my work, and the reasons why certain early works, particularly this painting from 2011, and I didn't like this painting for many years. I didn't really understand it. And I think this is probably the second or third, let's say, lecture that I've done where I begin with this painting, simply because I feel like it has become fundamental in relation to beginning a conversation about the intent of my practice. And I think the reason is that, obviously, I think there is a truth in that. What I like to firmly say that we're all very different, culturally different, for whatever reasons throughout, let's say, contemporary or modern histories. We find ourselves in certain places, and just to sidestep for a second, I was thinking about Mondrian and Mondrian as a migrant artist too, from the lowlands in Holland to New York, and the effect that had in his work, a tremendous effect. So if you see an early Mondrian, he paints these beautiful landscapes, and then to that practice find its way to this very hard edge abstraction that we know him for. In a similar way, I think when I was educated in London, I was trying to understand how I could forge a path as an artist, one that I would think is true to me. Also, how can I fit in my own history? Very often it's understood or said in terms of biographical, but I think it's much more, how does the DNA of me can enter a conversation in painting. And for example, in this painting, I think by writing Poggio, which is something that is quite pedestrian and quite ordinary, I, as an individual and as an artist, I wanted to insert a kind of an everyday activity into now what is the index and language of my painting practice. It is of course a seed, and it took many events and situations of repetition to eventually get rid of that anxiety, the anxiety to kind of say, or to use my painting practice as a kind of anchor of difference. And moving on, I want to draw your attention to a show I did at the South London Gallery, which is a non-profit institution in London. It was my very first institutional show in Europe. And I think still, let's say more or less 10 years on, I think of institutional shows as a kind of index, as an opportunity to yes, it's an experimentation, but it's an index where it's not about precision, but it's about teasing out ideas that might surface later on in the practice that could easily be kind of taken up later or can be discarded. And again, I'm still making reference to a kind of place of genesis, or my kind of let's say history as someone that was born in Latin America. So if I draw a line, this journey started at approximately 400 kilometers north of the equator, and Alberto, you can attest to this, since we're close to that part of the world. It was really thinking of the equator line, not necessarily as a because while I like to draw attention to a kind of personal history, at the same time it is that personal history that allows me to eradicate it at once. The equator is not a singular place. The equator is a geographical reference point that allow us to give us an understanding of where we are geographically. No, so the equator goes through Colombia, it goes through Ecuador, it goes through Brazil, it goes then through places in Africa and Asia. And so when I say I am 400 kilometers north of the equator, that could be anywhere in the world. So while I'm drawing attention to that, I'm also saying, well, that could be anywhere, which to me is very important, and is one of the things that I fundamentally and strongly believe in, that I am not interested in putting a heavy weight on a certain specific biographical place, and in a way the exhibition was put together with that idea in mind, as to say this room, in as it were, is a kind of an amalgamation of the world, and I am running through it, and is indeed a lifelong endeavor, as you will see in other projects that you'll have an opportunity to discuss later on in this delivery. And here, I wanna pay attention to these guys. So these are stickers or food stuff that I both found in my journeys, and I collected them. Some of them are collaged from studio material, and I wanted to place them around at a certain height. Also thinking about this idea of the equator as a kind of as a what I like to call as a 0 point. No, not to think of north or south, but really as a kind of 0 point, and from that point we can dance and we can maneuver up or down as we wish, without any kind of let's say political antagonism, but to really give myself the freedom to maneuver quite freely. Hence, making reference to the equator. It just so happens that I am from that part of the world, so it becomes quite relevant in the context of my history. Just to and this, so moving a year on, 2014, New York, Davis Runner Gallery. Again, another project which Alberto was involved in. I think this show, it's probably the one that it was my very first show in New York, and it's a broader conversation in relation to trade, to economics, to also using my broad, let's say, cultural understanding to establish a conversation in relation to what I believe opening up space in the work does. And so here, I am utilizing a very lifelong, as it were, relationship with a sugar factory, a family, notions of post-war trade and dynamics, and bringing them really at the center of trade and commerce, and capitalism, which is New York. I think at the time some people questioned, why was this not at a museum? But I said, well, it doesn't really matter. It's not really. It's beyond the gesture of the artwork or it to be an art piece. To me, it was really a social experiment, and to also highlight and to commemorate too the history of my mother, who at one point in her early years, until the age of 30, 34, she worked at this factory at an assembly line, and the purpose here was to use the gallery as a kind of semi-production line for 2 months, and not obviously to have the people that had traveled from Colombia, not to have them as kind of guinea pigs in a gallery space, but this shelving system here was kind of the shield that created. So beyond that shelving system, there is indeed quite a large assembly line, and so the idea was that there are notions of a kind of pseudo functional space that alluded to I guess installation art, commemorating, my mother here who's fallen asleep. She must have been maybe in her like mid-20s, working at a sugar factory. And the title talks about ideas of a mercantile novel, so notions of 19th century trade, treated as a kind of novella, no, as a kind of life story. But ironically too, Mira and Rebel, who are here also, they were part of that kind of narrative, no, in relation to when we worked together in 2012, and it was actually them who introduced me to this family. So I think the mercantile novel also, in a way, starts in Miami, where we have a very casual lunch, and I am sitting among the owners of this factory, which I knew from a child perspective, but I had no relationship to them as an artist, and it was there in Miami where, so it's almost like this room is full of anecdotes, which is very beautiful, and I think that kind of journey began, and I think doing that show was very much, I needed to take it left field, so it wasn't about necessarily putting paintings in a gallery space, but I think more profoundly for me was to analyze where things were heading in relation to, let's say, my career as an artist, and to have an understanding of the world geographically, just like the previous work alluded to notions of geography and material. I think here it was much more of a conceptual journey that I wanted to establish in relationship to New York, and I think that will come up again later in a more recent work, which is currently on at the Shed in New York. So here is the individuals that worked. They all came from Colombia. They all kind of different generations. Cesar Caicedo here, who's the CEO and owner of the factory, and this is the name of the factory, Colombina. And moving forward, a year later, back to Colombia at the University Museum. And so this show, I think this was probably one of the most complicated shows to do, because it is my first exhibition in Colombia. There's a kind of expectation as to how can I engage with a place that somehow, if it has felt so nostalgically close, but in truth incredibly different and also distant, since I really didn't grow up there, but has always been incredibly present, initially in the paintings, as you saw, in relation to a kind of cultural engagement, and I think at the time I was preparing for the Venice Biennial in again also in 2015, and I was working through a lot of these, developing a new body of work, which is a body of black paintings that do not necessarily are traditionally this manifested in space, but it's much more about playing with shape and the physical space. It is also a body of work that I like to think about in relation to darkness, darkness in terms of energy, darkness in terms of the anxiety of a negative space that, in human terms, we all have. We all have a kind of darkness inside us. So I wanted to create a kind of platform for that darkness to be extracted and to exist physically in space. And I think Bogota as a city is an incredibly dark city in relation to nature and the weather. It's it's incredibly moody city. It's a very similar altitude to Aspen, but I think the clouds and of course its geographical position make it so much more intense. Somehow the night in Colombia, it's a very dark night. It's hard to explain. The energy there is somehow very complex, and I don't really want to talk about violence or let's say the kind of typical story of Colombia as a kind of violent country. Actually, I am much more interested in nature and how nature has managed to save people. I think people that find themselves in a very suffocated existence find solace in nature. So nature, I mean, you know, if we were talking about violence, you know, historically speaking, places like Aspen, one can say, was very violent, you know, in relation to a kind of colonial history going back to the 16th century. But I think I see these kind of canvases as a kind of bat, no, that's kind of moving in space, and I also obviously too, one can say to the kind of physical relationship that he has to the body, to the human body, and how that those two relations feed off each other. And so for me, that show was very important to begin to think about a parallel engagement that has its own kind of existence, and at times in certain exhibitions it crosses, or there is a kind of coming together, and we will see examples of this in other images. And same year, maybe towards the end of 2015, again, it's beginning to stay true to this idea of diversifying, of wanting to have or to live, to experience cultural difference, and to have relationships with different communities, not just on the surface level, not just through simply arriving at a place, at a museum, and to do a show. Initially it starts that way, perhaps, but then I'm constantly looking for other ways in which the engagement becomes much more profound. And so the show, which was this project, it wasn't really a show, but it was much more of a project that lasted 6 months to a year, was called For the Souls of the Rotten Mighty, which again alludes to this idea of darkness, of energy, of matter in the body, in the individual. And here I am collaborating with a Mudang, which is a kind of spiritual leader, is a female spiritual leader in South Korea, which has a very close connection to spirituality and Buddhism. And as a kind of offering from my side, I bring my black canvases. I bring these papier-mâché figures that, in my, let's say, Colombian background, folk history, they do also have a kind of spiritual relationship to consumerism. and also this book, which is part of an ongoing series of drawings in aeroplanes, which I'll get into later. But it's a book fundamentally of images of my family from the 70s to the mid 2000s. And what we started to do there was the kind of experimentations in spiritual rituals and my own kind of rhythmic desire to follow through not necessarily much of a cultural understanding, but to bring my own openness and to engage freely through in their kind of rituals, and that culminated in quite a remarkable, what I like to say, installation of black paintings in the forest outside of Seoul, in a town called Anyang. We're actually very similar to Aspen, not as beautiful, but it's similar in its kind of energy, in relationship to how nature is so imposing. And so this is one of the canvases here that was installed in the forest, and it stayed there for a year. So it was really, I traveled back and forth, and it was really beautiful to see these black canvases, in a way, change with the course of the seasons. I mean, here we see it in the snow. And also when it was spring, to see the small flowers kind of begin to manifest themselves. So it was also a kind of project that it made me rethink the existence of this idea of the black paintings in relation to architecture, in relation to where indeed they would exist, whether it was longer necessary for these paintings to actually be produced in a let's say typical studio context, and actually kind of marry them more to a much more unconventional, but somehow a much more enriching place and space in the middle of the forest. So that was a really profound encounter. As the year went on, it was somehow a much more true that needed to be the case, that the whole kind of thinking around these black paintings needed to change. And so here we were. So we fastened the black paintings on our backs, and we made our way up. It's very similar to hiking. So I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. But it was obviously much more physical. So here I come back, or I bring back into the conversation notions of the cross-cultural, it's the frequencies of the world, drawing, and the non-binary existence of let's say the human being in different cultures. So in 2013, I started this project in Colombia, in Bogotá and also in my region. At a beautiful school in Bogotá called Menora, no? And also in my own former school in Bogotá, in Colombia, in my village in the south. And the idea of the project, I think, at the time was to think of drawing, or to think of drawing as both as a practice that as is so important in the genesis of art production, whether you're a sculptor or a painter or an architect, or simply as you engage in the production of visual culture, drawing is fundamental. And I know through, let's say, artists like Picasso or the Buffet, that they have placed fundamental importance in drawing. And to me, drawing is incredibly important too. I think I don't really consider myself a painter. I think I found ways and mechanisms to make drawings in large scale, and to find and assert a freedom through materials that obviously are traditionally within the painting tradition. But Frequencies is a project that needed to at the core of it have a collaboration and a relationship with children. And so what I began to do was to very diligently with my friends and family, and a very good friend of mine who's a social scientist, Clara Dublanc, we began to identify relationships around the world, from Zambia, Kenya, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, to Japan, LA, Europe, and Latin America and South America, where we would, through a very, let's say, down-to-earth network of personal and close relationships, we started to install canvases on the desks of schools. And the idea was that the kids needed to be between the age of 10 and 16, so it's a kind of high school age. And my idea was to install blank canvases and leave them there for 6 months, with the hope that the children will find these canvases engaging enough for them to intervene the canvases without any instructions, and subsequently, after a period of 6 months, that I would find a kind of intervention that delved between the conscious and the unconscious, so that due to the fact that it's been a considerable amount of time, that the fever of the child wanting to intervene and engage very consciously on that canvas will die out over time, and that you have something that is a little bit much more feeding the unconscious through mark making, and also naturally, and you can see, the patina of these canvases vary from place to place. So the canvas that kind of dominates the picture is a canvas from Harlem, to this one that is a little bit off center here on the right hand side. It's from South Africa, in Johannesburg. And so again, the project is both, I see it as a kind of conceptual idea, as something that it's at the core of my thinking process in relation to thinking diversely about cultures, and the DNA of the cultural information that a child is receiving in that particular place being fed to us and delivered through this conscious and unconscious process. Two, also a geographical difference in the patina of a material being kind of affected by the environment that these canvases find themselves in. And Frequencies is an ongoing project. It's been going on for 6 years. I've been to more or less, in collaboration with my friends and colleagues, more or less 30 to 40 different countries and a similar number of cities. And we have an archive that's growing that is in the region of maybe 20,000 canvases. What is also interesting to note is that since 2017, what I've decided to do was that rather than to jump into a particular place and only do 1 or 2 schools, I found it important to go to India and do the entire country for 2 years. We've done a similar thing with China, and we just finished. So we have a huge archive in China that's going to come to Europe, and a similar thing I want to do in Latin America, almost to kind of think of the micro and macro differences within one nationhood. This was a project in Kiev, in Ukraine, where I decided to bring together a group of 30 different countries, from Nepal to South Africa, Lebanon, the U.S. with Harlem, China, Brazil, India, and just kind of put them together and as a kind of amalgam. So making my way all the way to the now, and the current moment. This is an installation of a painting show currently on view at Davis Warner Gallery in London. The title of the show is called Manifestation. And just as I began this presentation with thinking about painting in relation to a kind of historical anchor, biographical anchor perhaps, and have more or less quickly given you an array of examples as to how I see it, not in relation to a biography, but in relation to actually diversity, and struggling with those ideas and trying to create a kind of a broad range in my practice that does not simply have a singular focus and engagement, but there are different lines of conversation that are happening in parallel, that some are very explicitly individual, like this painting show, or there are necessities for collaboration, like a project like Frequencies, or to think of painting as a kind of broader symbolic idea, no, in relation to these black paintings and notions of darkness and energy that in a way go beyond myself, but only stay within the symbolic and give me the opportunity to experiment and to do projects in a number of diverse places. I think with the show, I needed to. It was important to reaffirm again for myself what does painting mean, and what is painting in relation to my desires as an artist. What is the importance of painting? What line of engagement does painting have? Is it at the core of it a kind of Western understanding? Because I was educated in the West, and so one can talk about it in relation to American abstraction. We could go back to the 19th century and think of expressionism and how that affected the course of art and the kind of art, particularly in relation to painting, that we have in the U.S. or in relation to Gutai painting, let's say in Asia, more specific in Japan, and as to why those practices developed the way they did. And to me, it's always been very fundamental to see it horizontally and not vertically. So this show, as I like to call it, manifestation, it is really reaffirming or bringing back into the center a conversation about painting, a concern with drawing. That at the core of it, we have a very deep, broad, horizontal cultural awareness. But in truth, you go into this gallery space and you see a painting exhibition that equally important is my own energy and my own aesthetic resolve to do with color, gesture, and texture. Because sadly, you won't see it here on these pictures, but there is something incredibly textural and one can say to a certain degree aggressive about these pictures, aggressive in scale. And I think it isn't about monumentality. It's much more about, I think, a physical energy that needs to be rendered in a certain scale with a certain intensity, and still, ironically, thinking about drawing, even though the notions of drawing have become formalized in painting. And so, as we come to the end of the presentation, this entitled Search Painting 2018-19, which is also in the exhibition in London, it and as I mentioned, Impressionism. I was I'm a huge fan of Monet and Matisse. And I remember as a student before art school, making a lot of renderings and impressions in the style of these two very important artists for the history of Western art, 19th century modern history. But I couldn't really find my way. There was no reason as to why. Or how would I end up making work or honoring artists that I've admire for beauty and aesthetic resolve, and I think recently I kind of found my way, not necessarily through their practice, because I don't think there is nothing in common, but reading about Monet. Some time ago, I discovered that Monet had cataracts when he was doing the water lily paintings later on in his life. And I found that incredibly interesting, particularly because there is something magical in relation to color, to gesture, and and um, and virtuosity in those water lily paintings, particularly when you go to the museums in Paris. Um, but I also kind of made up this narrative that I actually think that it was a kind of utopian projection that made the paintings, and not so much. There was a kind of resistance that happened. No, the fact that you couldn't really see, or that it was very difficult to see. But effectively, at the end of the day, he's painting his garden, something that has been there constantly. So there's something about memory, about the presence and the future in relation to the water lily paintings. Um, and and then I started to think about society as a wider, the context of wider society. And then I kind of said, what would it be like if there was a social cataracts? So the notion of society being completely in the future and not in the present, so you couldn't really see the present. And this might not make a lot of sense, but I think the underpainting, I think that for some years I was struggling with how to bring into a kind of painting formality my social, political, geographical engagement and views. We saw it with the mercantile novel. We saw it with Frequencies as a kind of, let's say, social, geographical experiment. And I think even though in this painting there is a kind of desire for virtuosity within gesture, it was really a negative disposition. So this idea of cataracts, a kind of resistance, a kind of darkness, that a kind of friction that allowed me to get to display my own resolve in aesthetics, in the name of Monet, but not really because of the work, but because of his physical disability, and then to think of the physical disability in relation to society and the social condition, in a way.
So I'm going to step in and start to ask you a couple of questions. That was amazing. So talking about the social part of your practice, you've done a lot of different things that have really surprised people, right? And showing your the first New York exhibition at David's Warner. I've been fortunate to see all these shows. Saw the show that you did at the Rubel Family Collection, and the anticipation in advance of that New York show, the fact that you chose not to show paintings there was a really bold kind of gesture. And then what I wanted to ask you about was at Laura Hopman's painting exhibition at MoMA, you had your paintings folded up and on the floor, and you let people kind of unfold them and touch them, and that was also very unexpected and non-traditional and very personal. So can you talk about that specific decision about hanging? There were paintings that hung on the wall in Laura's show, but there were also paintings that were on the floor, and I think maybe there was a misperception of why you did that. Maybe some people read it as disrespectful, but I think it was about this kind of social practice and this availability of art to a broader public.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in conversation with Laura, it was always it was how to bring all these different concerns together, and narrow them down into one gesture that is, as the show entailed. It was broadly speaking a painting show, and as we know, the Museum of Modern Art, the the quintessential museum of painting history, more so kind of post-war painting history, and I wanted to bring into that conversation my own kind of concerns. It was also to kind of to take notions of painting sideways and to allow a public to have a much more visceral connection, which to me I think physically is very difficult because I obviously work in that manner, but I gave myself into how an audience might not actually have that relationship, particularly when institutions and public or private obviously have a very specific code of conduct, with good reason, obviously, to protect the integrity of work. But I think as a young artist and who is constantly thinking about the engagement of art and what that can do, I really wanted to eradicate all those kind of let's say, it's not really barriers, but all those kind of rules and situations around our relationship with art, which it happens in frequencies too in many ways.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's exciting, right? And challenging, and people are afraid when things are different, right? So, can you talk about how you? We were talking earlier about how you make some of the gestures, and how it captures your sort of physical energy, and you made a reference to carbon paper, or how marks get transferred from one surface to another. Can you describe that?
Yeah. So I think let me just quickly maybe. So this is a really good. This image is a really good example, even though it's a drawing. In this drawing, which is a small format drawing, is a combination of pen, red pen and black pen. I am initially, before even thinking about painting, it was always this idea of how can I enlarge drawing. So it was a scientific kind of idea, no, the fractal. So even if you multiply something, it doesn't change, it doesn't deform. So I like to believe that mark making, in a certain way, has notions and ideas of the fractal, and at the same time, I didn't want to. Again, this notion of conscious and the unconscious, I think obviously I'm consciously setting up a situation that I know I'm going to get certain results. It doesn't mean that the results are aesthetically or formally good in relation to judging what a good painting or a bad painting is, but it's fundamentally about an exercise. So setting up a platform, putting down a canvas, rendering that canvas with oil paint, and then putting another blank canvas on top. So you become blind again, and picking up a large pointed stylus and begin to frenetically download my physical energy and emotion onto that canvas, and we see it, I think, quite clearly in this kind of area here, or in this underpainting, or here perhaps. I know the images are not very strong, but these red lines were produced in such manner where I am obscuring what I'm actually not seeing. I'm simply giving my physical energy the way, and then making the judgments later as to what I think it's a good painting or indeed as something that is just an exercise or just a physical exercise. So in truth, what you have in that exercise, in that physical exercise, what I like to say a success rate of maybe 30%. 30% of the exercise becomes a resolve painting, and the other 70% it becomes material to then collage into a larger kind of studio painting practice, which is this manifestation 2019 is part of, and those ideas were there early on. Those ideas were, maybe I should dance back to the first painting, because I think that shows it quite clearly. So here you have the kind of black, the red, and the blue, which is a large-scale canvas painting, but it very clearly resembles the drawing, no, from before. The idea of the fractal, that there is no shift there's no deformity in the mark. There is simply a scale shift.
So, one more question. If someone asks you why you make art, what would you say?
I think making art is a kind of. I feel like I'm sick. I have a sickness, and it's a kind of both physical, emotional sickness, and art has become a vessel to deal with that. I don't think. I think it could have been art. It could have been music. It could have been. It could have been poetry. It could have been literature. It could have been sports. But I think in this case, and for my, let's say, my character, it's I found it to be. I don't think I have delved into art and art history and not to say that I've taken control of it either, but I think I've negotiating and have negotiated the terms in which I engage with art to allow for that sickness to be dealt with, no? For as a sickness in which art is a kind of therapy for, and therefore I've been able to think as to how can I develop an infrastructure to allow all that anxiety to be constantly dealt with.
That's a good way to end. Art fills many roles, and thank you so much for sharing with us your practice with the honesty and integrity that you always do.
Thank you, Heidi. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming.